The richest man in Ashcroft County had just been buried. By noon, his 3 children were already discussing which rooms they wanted in the mansion. His oldest son, Charles, wanted to renovate the library. His daughter, Victoria, planned to sell the antique collection. His youngest son, Andrew, only cared about one thing. The estate has to be worth at least $80 million. None of them noticed the elderly woman quietly polishing the silver tray in the corner. She had worked inside Whitmore Manor for 31 years. Most visitors never learned her name. To them, she was simply the housekeeper. Her name was Eleanor Hayes. She had cleaned every hallway, prepared every Christmas dinner, opened the front door for presidents, governors, judges, and business leaders. Yet after 3 decades, the family still treated her as though she were part of the furniture. At exactly 2 o'clock, everyone gathered inside the mansion's grand drawing room. The air felt heavy. Attorney James Holloway placed a leather folder on the table. "I've represented Mr. Whitmore for 28 years. I can honestly say, I've never handled a will like this." Charles smiled confidently. "I'm sure Father found one last way to make us wait." James didn't smile. He certainly did. He unfolded the first page. Under the terms of Harold Whitmore's final will, the Whitmore estate, the mansion, the surrounding land, the investment portfolio, and every controlling share of Whitmore Industries are transferred immediately. Charles leaned forward. Victoria crossed her arms. Andrew smiled. James looked toward the back of the room. To Eleanor Hayes. The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Charles laughed first. "Very funny." James remained silent. "I'm not joking." Victoria stood so quickly her chair fell backward. "She cleans the house." Andrew pointed toward Eleanor. "There has to be another page." "There is." James calmly turned it over. "It repeats exactly the same decision." Every eye turned toward Eleanor. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply lowered the polishing cloth onto the silver tray. Charles walked toward her. "What did you do?" Eleanor met his eyes. "Nothing." "You expect us to believe that?" "I don't need you to believe me." Victoria's voice became sharp. "You manipulated him." Eleanor slowly shook her head. "No." Andrew stepped closer. "My father built this company. My grandfather built this house. And you're telling me it all belongs to a housekeeper?" James interrupted. "It belongs to Mrs. Hayes. As of 11:43 this morning." Charles looked ready to explode. "We're contesting the will." James nodded. "Mr. Whitmore expected that." He reached into the leather folder. Then he removed something unexpected. Not another will. Not a letter. A small iron key. Dark with age. Its edges were worn smooth from decades of use. James placed it gently on the table. "He instructed me to give this to Mrs. Hayes." Charles grabbed the key before Eleanor could reach it. "What does this open?" James answered without hesitation. "I don't know. It's the only part of the estate Mr. Whitmore never allowed me to see." For the first time, Eleanor's calm expression changed. She stared at the key, almost as though she had hoped never to see it again. Then she quietly whispered, "So, he finally decided." Charles frowned. "Decided what?" Eleanor slowly looked toward the second floor of the mansion. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "The door stays locked for 30 years. Unless Harold dies before me." She looked back at the family. "It seems. Today is that day." The room fell completely silent. Because every member of the Whitmore family had lived in that mansion for decades, and not one of them had ever heard there was a locked room. Charles refused to believe the room existed. He followed Eleanor upstairs to prove she was lying. 5 minutes later, he stood frozen outside a weathered oak door. The rusty key fit perfectly, and carved into the wood were 7 words that changed everything. "Only open this after I am gone." No one spoke. Charles kept the old iron key clutched tightly in his hand. He stared at the weathered oak door at the end of the hallway. I've lived here for 40 years. There has never been a room here. Eleanor looked at the door. There always has been. Victoria folded her arms. If that's true, why didn't any of us know? Eleanor answered without looking away. Because your father never wanted you to. Andrew stepped forward. This is ridiculous. It's probably an old storage room. James quietly cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore left another instruction. He specifically ordered that every member of the family be present when this room is opened. Charles scoffed. Fine. Let's get this over with. He shoved the key into the lock. It wouldn't turn. He tried again. Nothing. Growing impatient, he forced it harder. The old lock refused to move. Charles stepped back. It's rusted. Eleanor slowly held out her hand. May I? He hesitated, then dropped the key into her palm. She gently brushed years of dust away from the keyhole. Without force, without struggle, she turned the key. A soft click echoed through the hallway. The heavy door slowly swung open. A cool breath of air drifted out. The room was spotless. Not a single piece of dust covered the furniture. Charles frowned. That's impossible. No one has been inside for 30 years. Eleanor quietly replied. Someone has. She stepped inside. The others followed. The room didn't look like a secret vault. It looked like an office. A large wooden desk stood near the window. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls. Family photographs filled one corner. An old grandfather clock ticked softly, as though time had never stopped. Victoria looked around. This doesn't make any sense. Andrew walked toward the desk. There's nothing valuable here. Then he noticed something. Every object on the desk had a small handwritten label. Do not move. Charles ignored it. He picked up an old fountain pen. The moment he lifted it, a sharp beep echoed through the room. Everyone froze. Another beep. Then another. James looked toward the ceiling. Security system. A hidden panel slid open. A small projector slowly lowered from above. Charles stared in disbelief. What is this? The projector switched on by itself. A familiar face appeared on the wall. Harold Whitmore. He looked older than anyone remembered. But his eyes were steady. He looked directly into the camera. If you're seeing this. Someone ignored my instructions. Charles slowly placed the pen back on the desk. Harold smiled. I thought it would be you. Victoria looked at her brother. Andrew whispered. How did he know? Harold continued. This room was never built to protect my money. It was built to protect the truth. Charles laughed nervously. What truth? Harold answered as though he had heard him. The truth about my family. The smile disappeared from his face. For 30 years, I watched every one of you become successful. You earned promotions. You built businesses. You attended charity galas. People admired you. He leaned slightly closer to the camera. But success and character are not the same thing. The room became silent. Harold pointed toward Eleanor. Everything inside this room exists because of one person. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes. Charles looked at her. You knew about this? Eleanor nodded once. I promised your father. Harold continued. I trusted Eleanor with every secret I couldn't trust my own family to protect. Andrew frowned. Why? Harold took a slow breath. Because loyalty isn't proven when life is easy. It's proven when keeping a promise costs you everything. Eleanor lowered her eyes. 31 years. She had never spoken a word. Not to friends. Not to reporters. Not even to the family she served. Harold reached toward a wooden box sitting on his desk. If you're standing in this room, that box is still there. Victoria immediately noticed it. A dark walnut box sat beneath the window. Its lid was sealed with a strip of red wax. Across the top, 7 words had been carefully engraved. Do not break this seal without Eleanor. Charles walked toward it. This has gone far enough. He reached for the box. Eleanor's voice stopped him. If you break that seal, you'll never see your father the same way again. Charles looked directly at her. What did he do? Eleanor didn't answer. She simply stared at the box. The same box she had protected for 3 decades. The same box she had hoped would never have to be opened. Charles broke the wax seal anyway. Inside wasn't money. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't a confession. It was an old photograph. And the moment Eleanor saw the face in that picture, she quietly whispered, Harold, you promised this would stay buried. No one touched the walnut box. It sat in the middle of the desk, silent, untouched. 30 years of dust surrounded it, but not a single speck rested on the red wax seal. Eleanor stared at it. Her hands remained at her sides. Charles looked from the box to Eleanor. You've seen this before. She answered quietly. Many times. And you never opened it? No. Why? Because I gave my word. Charles laughed. A promise. That's what's stopping you? Eleanor finally looked at him. I worked for your father for 31 years. I broke dishes. I burned dinners. I made mistakes. But I never broke my word. The room fell silent. James stepped closer to the desk. Mrs. Hayes. Mr. Whitmore left one final instruction for this room. Eleanor slowly nodded. I know. James unfolded a small sheet of paper. He read it aloud. The box will only be opened if Eleanor agrees. Not because she works for me. Because she understands what it will cost. Charles frowned. What is that supposed to mean? Eleanor closed her eyes. It means once you know the truth, you'll never remember your father the same way again. Victoria crossed her arms. So our father wasn't the man we thought he was? Eleanor looked at her. No. He was exactly the man you thought he was. That's what makes this so painful. Andrew walked around the room. His eyes stopped at the bookshelves. Hundreds of journals filled the shelves. Every spine carried nothing except a year. 1995. 1996. 1997. All the way to the present. What are these? Eleanor followed his gaze. Your father's journals. Charles pulled one from the shelf. 1998. He opened it. Every page was filled with neat handwriting. Not business notes. Not financial records. People. Names. Dates. Conversations. Arguments. Birthdays. Apologies that had never been spoken. Small acts of kindness. Small betrayals. Everything. Victoria whispered. He wrote about us? Eleanor nodded. Every day. Charles flipped through another journal. Then another. There were thousands of pages. My God. He documented our entire lives. James quietly said. He once told me memory can lie. But ink rarely does. Andrew stopped in front of a framed family photograph. It showed the 5 of them. Harold. His late wife. Charles. Victoria. Andrew. Everyone smiling. Andrew frowned. Something's wrong. The others walked over. What? He pointed to the corner of the picture. There was another child. Barely visible. Standing slightly behind Harold. A teenage boy. One hand rested on Harold's shoulder. Charles stared at the photograph. I've never seen him before. Victoria shook her head. Neither have I. Eleanor didn't move. She simply looked at the photograph for several long seconds. Then she quietly said, You have. You just don't remember. The room became silent. Charles turned toward her. Who is he? Eleanor looked directly at him. He was the only person your father ever called. My 4th child. No one spoke. Andrew frowned. What happened to him? Eleanor looked away. The answer is inside the box. Charles immediately reached toward it again. Eleanor stopped him. Before you open it, answer one question. Charles looked annoyed. What? She held his gaze. If the truth proves your father was wrong, will you still love him? Charles didn't answer, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure. Eleanor slowly placed both hands on the walnut box. She took a deep breath. Then she whispered, I prayed this day would never come. With trembling fingers, she broke the 30-year-old wax seal. The lid slowly opened. Inside, there wasn't a fortune. There wasn't a confession. There was only a single worn photograph. Harold Whitmore stood beside the teenage boy. On the back, written in Harold's unmistakable handwriting, were 8 words. The greatest mistake of my entire life. The room was completely silent. The old photograph lay on the desk between them. Harold Whitmore stood proudly beside a teenage boy. One hand rested on the boy's shoulder. Both of them were smiling. On the back, only 8 words. The greatest mistake of my entire life. Charles looked at Eleanor. Who is he? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she carefully picked up the photograph. Her thumb gently brushed away years of dust. Her eyes softened. I haven't seen this picture in almost 30 years. Andrew frowned. You knew him. I did. Victoria crossed her arms. Then tell us. Eleanor nodded slowly. His name was Daniel Carter. The 3 siblings looked at one another. None of them recognized the name. Eleanor smiled sadly. You wouldn't. Your father made sure of that. James looked surprised. He erased him? No. He tried to erase the pain. She looked back at the photograph. Daniel came here when he was 15. He had nowhere else to go. His parents died in a highway accident. There were no grandparents, no aunts, no uncles willing to take him. So Harold did. Charles stared at the picture. He adopted him? Eleanor shook her head. No. He wanted to. But Daniel refused. Why? Because he said. She smiled through her tears. You don't need papers to treat someone like family. Silence filled the room. For the first time, no one was thinking about the inheritance. Eleanor continued. Your father gave him a bedroom, a place at the dinner table, a key to this house, and eventually, a place in his heart. Andrew whispered. Then why don't we remember him? Eleanor looked at him. You do. You've simply forgotten. Charles frowned. That's impossible. Eleanor walked to a bookshelf. She removed one of Harold's journals. The year stamped on the spine was 1997. She opened it carefully. A folded newspaper clipping slipped onto the desk. James picked it up. The headline read, Local student wins National Science Scholarship. Below the headline, a smiling teenage boy. The same boy from the photograph. Daniel Carter. Victoria stared at it. He looks. She stopped. What? He looks familiar. Eleanor nodded. He should. He practically lived in this house. She turned another page in the journal. Every entry mentioned Daniel. Daniel fixed the old clock today. Daniel helped Andrew with his math homework. Daniel convinced Charles not to quit college. Daniel stayed with Victoria all night when she was sick. Page after page. Year after year. It was impossible to ignore. Daniel wasn't a guest. He was family. Andrew slowly sat down. I don't understand. If he meant so much to Dad, what happened? The smile disappeared from Eleanor's face. She carefully closed the journal. Then she looked at each of them. For one beautiful summer, this house finally felt complete. Her voice became quieter. Then one accusation destroyed everything. Charles immediately looked up. What accusation? Eleanor didn't answer. Instead, she reached into the walnut box. There was only one item left inside. An old cassette tape. Its paper label had faded with age, but one sentence was still readable. Play only after they remember Daniel. James looked at Eleanor. I don't think they're there yet. She slowly shook her head. No. They're starting to remember. But they still don't understand. She looked toward the mansion window. Rain had begun to fall outside, almost as though the house itself remembered that day. Then she quietly whispered, "The hardest part isn't learning what happened to Daniel. It's learning who accused him." Charles stared at the cassette tape. His hands began to tremble, because for the first time that day, he wasn't afraid of losing the inheritance. He was afraid. The person who destroyed Daniel's life might be someone sitting in that very room. The rain continued tapping against the windows. No one spoke. The old cassette tape remained inside the walnut box. Charles couldn't take his eyes off it. So that's it. The answer is on this tape? Eleanor slowly closed the lid of the box. No. The tape tells only one day. The truth took years. Victoria frowned. What happened to Daniel? Eleanor looked toward the fireplace. He loved this family. He trusted every one of you. He believed he had finally found a home. She paused. Then one afternoon, everything changed. Andrew quietly asked, "What happened?" Eleanor took a slow breath. It was Harold's 50th birthday. The house was full. Business partners, friends, family, nearly 60 guests. Charles nodded. I remember that party. You should. It was the last happy day Daniel ever spent here. The room fell silent. Eleanor continued. That evening, Harold invited everyone into the library. He wanted to show them something. A collection of rare bearer bonds. They had belonged to his father, worth several $1,000,000. Victoria looked surprised. I never knew we had bearer bonds. Very few people did. They were kept inside a small black safe behind the painting over the fireplace. Andrew frowned. What happened to them? They disappeared. Silence. Charles looked at Eleanor. They were stolen? That was everyone's first thought. James quietly added, and bearer bonds are almost impossible to trace. Eleanor nodded. Exactly. The police searched the mansion. They questioned every employee, every guest. They found nothing. Andrew looked confused. Then why Daniel? Eleanor's eyes filled with sadness. Because someone remembered seeing him near the library. Charles immediately shook his head. That doesn't prove anything. No, it didn't. But people weren't looking for proof. They were looking for someone to blame. Victoria whispered. So they accused him. Eleanor nodded. They searched his room. Andrew leaned forward. Did they find anything? She closed her eyes. Yes. The room froze. They found one bearer bond. Charles stood so quickly his chair scraped across the floor. Then he did take them. Eleanor looked directly at him. No. Someone wanted everyone to believe he did. Charles frowned. How do you know? She answered without hesitation. Because I cleaned that room. Every morning. Every afternoon. I changed the sheets. I dusted the shelves. I knew every drawer. When the police searched, they found the bond inside the top drawer. She shook her head. Daniel never used that drawer. Andrew looked confused. How can you be sure? Eleanor gave a sad smile. Because the drawer was broken. It had been jammed shut for almost 3 months. I had asked Mr. Whitmore several times to repair it. It never opened. James looked stunned. Then, she nodded. When the detective pulled it open without any resistance, I knew someone had already fixed it and placed the bond inside. The room became completely silent. Charles slowly sat back down. My God. Eleanor continued. I tried to tell the officers. They said I was protecting him. I tried to tell Harold. He believed me. But by then, The newspapers had already printed Daniel's name. Victoria lowered her head. So everyone believed he was guilty. Eleanor nodded. He lost his scholarship. His friends disappeared. People crossed the street to avoid him. Andrew quietly asked, "What did Daniel say?" Eleanor looked toward the photograph. He kept repeating the same sentence. Her voice broke. "Mrs. Hayes, please tell Mr. Whitmore I didn't do this." The room fell silent again. Charles covered his face. "What did Dad do?" Eleanor looked at him. He spent the next 30 years trying to answer one question. Who planted that bond? James looked toward the cassette tape. Is that why he kept it? Eleanor nodded once. No. He kept it because, for 29 years, he believed it was empty. Charles frowned. What do you mean? Eleanor carefully picked up the cassette. There was no label when Harold found it. It wasn't discovered during the investigation. It was found. She stopped. Her fingers tightened around the tape. It was found 1 week before Harold died. Every person in the room stared at her. James quietly asked, "Where?" Eleanor looked toward the old grandfather clock standing in the corner of the room. Hidden inside that clock. Charles slowly turned toward it. His heartbeat quickened. Because if someone had hidden the tape there, they had expected it to stay buried forever. Eleanor handed the cassette to James. He carefully turned it over. On the other side, written in faded blue ink, were 6 chilling words. If you hear this, I'm sorry. The room was silent. James carefully carried the old cassette player from the bookshelf. It looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. He wiped away the dust, inserted the cassette, then looked at Eleanor. Are you ready? She closed her eyes for a moment. I've been ready for 30 years. James pressed play. Static filled the room. For several seconds, nothing. Then, a young man's trembling voice. If you're hearing this, I don't know if I'm still alive. Charles immediately looked at the photograph. Daniel. Eleanor slowly nodded. It was recorded the night he left. Daniel's voice continued. I'm making this because no one believes me anymore. I've repeated the truth so many times. I don't even recognize my own voice. A long breath. I didn't steal Mr. Whitmore's bearer bonds. I swear I didn't. I don't even know where they were kept. Victoria quietly wiped away a tear. Daniel continued. I know who everyone thinks I am now. The newspapers. The neighbors. The police. They've already decided. So maybe this recording won't change anything. Another pause. But maybe. It'll help someone understand. Charles lowered his head. Daniel's voice softened. The Whitmores gave me a home. Harold gave me a future. Eleanor treated me like family. I could never repay them by stealing from them. The room remained completely still. Then Daniel said something that made everyone look up. I saw someone leave the library. Charles frowned. Andrew leaned forward. Daniel continued. I couldn't see the person's face. They were wearing Mr. Whitmore's raincoat. It was raining that night. I called out. They didn't answer. They walked straight toward the west staircase. Eleanor slowly looked toward the hallway. The west staircase. It connected directly to the family's private bedrooms. Not the guest rooms. Not the servants' quarters. Only the family's wing. Daniel continued. I told the detective. He said I was making excuses. I told Mr. Whitmore. He believed I was scared. I stopped talking after that. His breathing became heavier. I kept asking myself the same question. If the real thief wasn't afraid, why should I be? Silence. Then his voice cracked. Because they were part of the family. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Daniel continued. I won't say their name. I made Harold a promise. If they ever tell the truth themselves, they deserve a chance to live with it. Charles whispered. He knew. Eleanor nodded slowly. He knew. The recording wasn't over. Daniel took another deep breath. If you're hearing this after Mr. Whitmore is gone, please don't hate him. He wanted to protect his family. I wanted to protect mine. I think we were both wrong. The tape clicked. Silence. Then it stopped. No one spoke. James slowly pressed the stop button. The only sound in the room was the old grandfather clock. Tick, tick, tick. Charles looked at Eleanor. So Daniel knew who did it. Yes. And he never told anyone. No. Why? Eleanor looked down at the cassette. Because he believed people can change. Andrew whispered. And did they? Before Eleanor could answer, James reached into the walnut box one last time. There was something underneath the cassette. He removed a small cream-colored envelope. It had never been opened. Across the front, in Harold Whitmore's handwriting, were 6 simple words. Open only after hearing Daniel's voice. James carefully broke the seal. Inside, there was only one page. He read the first sentence aloud. His voice immediately changed. I know which one of my children betrayed him. The room froze. James slowly looked up from the letter. His hands were trembling. Because the next line didn't reveal only the guilty child. It explained why they framed Daniel. And once the truth came out, the Whitmore family would never carry its own name the same way again. James stood motionless. The letter trembled in his hands. Charles finally broke the silence. Read it. James nodded. Then he continued. If you are reading this, then Daniel's voice has finally been heard. It should have happened 30 years ago. James looked up briefly, then continued. I know which one of my children hid the bearer bonds. Charles closed his eyes. Victoria gripped the edge of the desk. Andrew couldn't look at anyone. James read the next line. It wasn't done for money. It was done for something far more dangerous. Jealousy. The room became perfectly still. Daniel was kind. He was brilliant. He earned every opportunity he received, without realizing it. He became everything one of my children feared they could never become. Charles whispered. No. James continued. The bonds were never sold. They were hidden inside the old grandfather clock. Every eye turned toward the clock. Eleanor quietly nodded. I found them. Andrew looked at her in disbelief. You found them? She walked slowly toward the clock, opened the small wooden panel beneath the pendulum, reached inside, then carefully placed a faded leather pouch on the desk. James slowly untied the string. Inside, every bearer bond, perfectly preserved, 30 years, untouched. Charles stared in disbelief. They were here. The whole time. Eleanor nodded. Harold found them 6 days before he died. Victoria whispered. Then why didn't he tell us? James answered by continuing the letter. Because by then, the money no longer mattered. The truth did. Silence. James turned the final page. The child responsible came to my room 2 nights before my surgery. They confessed everything. Not because they feared prison. Because they could no longer live with themselves. Andrew slowly stood. His chair slid backward. Tears filled his eyes. I told him. Charles turned toward him. What? Andrew couldn't stop crying. I was 16. I thought Dad loved Daniel more than me. I hid the bonds. I thought everyone would suspect him for one day. Just one day. His voice broke. I never imagined it would destroy his life. Victoria covered her mouth. Charles stepped backward in disbelief. Andrew continued. When the police found the bond, I was too afraid to admit what I'd done. Every day after that, it became harder. I kept waiting for tomorrow. Tomorrow became 30 years. The room was silent except for Andrew's sobs. Eleanor walked over to him. She wasn't angry. She wasn't cruel. She simply placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Andrew looked at her. I don't deserve forgiveness. Eleanor spoke softly. Perhaps not. But Daniel deserved the truth. James read Harold's final paragraph. If Andrew has confessed before this letter is read, then he has already accepted his punishment. If he has remained silent, then let this letter speak for him. Andrew looked down. I wanted to tell you. I was just too late. James folded the letter. There is one sentence left. He cleared his throat. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes. The mansion was never your reward. It was your burden. You protected my greatest failure for 30 years. You have carried enough. James reached into the folder. He removed one final document. The Whitmore estate will be sold. The proceeds will establish the Daniel Carter Foundation, a scholarship for children who lose their families. The remaining inheritance will be divided equally among my 3 children. Charles looked surprised. So Eleanor gets nothing? James smiled. Oh, she does. He handed Eleanor a small envelope. Inside, a single handwritten note. She read it, then quietly smiled for the first time all day. Victoria asked, "What did he write?" Eleanor carefully folded the paper. He wrote, "Thank you for keeping your promise when I couldn't keep mine." She looked around the room one last time. I never wanted this house. I only wanted Daniel's name to come home. Months later, the Whitmore mansion stood empty. Children from across the state applied for the first Daniel Carter Scholarship. Above the entrance to the new foundation, a bronze plaque carried Harold Whitmore's final words. A fortune can build a house. Only the truth can build a family.